Hi, friends. Father Kerry Walters here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one with a few tips on how to discover your own best true self from a guy called Robert the Devil. In the 13th century, the genre of what today we would call medieval romance was extremely popular. A medieval romance was a tale of daring do. Usually, the main character was a knight or sometimes even a member of royalty who goes on a quest to find a hidden treasure, to slay a dragon that's been terrorizing the countryside. And along the way, this nobleman, this hero, typically encounters a woman who he falls in love with. At the end of these romantic tales, the quest has been fulfilled, and the hero and his lady love live happily ever after. These tales were not only exciting, and that's part of the reason for their popularity, and they were not only love stories, which is another reason for their popularity, but they also typically conveyed some important moral or spiritual lesson to the readers and the listeners. There's one medieval romance that has always particularly struck my fancy. It's simply called Robert the Devil, Richard le Diable. It appeared in France in the mid 13th century. It breaks the mold of the formulaic medieval romance in that the hero is kind of an anti hero, and the quest is different than finding a hidden pot of gold or slaying a dragon. And even though there's a love story, the love is not consummated in this particular romance. And there is a really important spiritual lesson embedded within it. A lesson that, for example, in the 20th century, the Cistercian monk Thomas Merton could have made a big deal out of in his distinction, his famous distinction between our true selves and our false selves. Let me very briefly just tell you the plot of this particular romance, Robert the Devil. The Duchess of Normandy has been praying for a child for years and years, but she remains barren. And so one night, in agony, in despair, in extreme frustration, she renounces God and she prays to Satan for a child. Well, Satan has clearly been waiting for this invitation, and she becomes pregnant, and 9 months later gives birth to a child who is named Robert. Robert, even as an infant, is of rather large stature, so it's pretty clear he's going to grow up to be an enormously strong man with an almost demonic strength. From the very first day, however, Robert shows himself to be troublesome. He is so cantankerous as an infant that the Duchess has trouble keeping nurses. He worries at the breast whenever he's nursing, to such an extent that the wet nurses find themselves in great pain. When he gets a little bit older, he delights in mocking other boys or in teasing the knights that are in his father, the Duke of Normandy's castle. When they yawn, for example, so the romance tells us, the lad Robert will grab up a handful of ashes and shove it in their open mouths. He is a terror for priests and clerics in the countryside because he will not only verbally abuse them, but even physically strike them. He discovers that he hates everyone, and everyone fears him, and he enjoys that. And as he grows older and older, the atrocities that he performs become more and more horrendous until it's capped off by his attacking a convent that has 60 nuns in it. And with his bare hands, he strangles to death at least 50 of them. And the implication in the text, although it's not explicitly stated, is that he has sexually violated them as well. He has gained a reputation for being a devil, and people, including his own family, avoid him like the plague. He soon finds himself in solitude because no one can stand to be around him. And that seems to be a moment of awakening for Robert. Let me read you just a snippet of the romance. This occurs immediately after Robert has violated and murdered the nuns. Once he had done this, he rode off on his horse, whose whinnies and snorts sounded all through the forest. He spurred and prodded and pricked until he was back at his castle. He looked a hideous sight, but no one was there to see or to greet him. Robert dismounted and glanced all around. He looked up and down and throughout. He looked to the right, he looked to the left. Nowhere, however, was man or woman to be seen. He shouted for his squire to come take his horse, but it took a long while for the man to appear, so fearful, like all, to be anyone near. Robert was plunged deep into thought, wondering how it could possibly be, and what was the cause that he was so dreaded and feared. And Robert swore a solemn oath that he would seek no pleasure or repose until he'd have learned what made him so wicked and evil a man. Something about the social isolation that his own wickedness brought upon him has awakened within him some self-reflection, an inquiry into why he is the person that he is, and he resolves to discover the answer to that question. So he takes himself off, and he eventually encounters a holy man, a hermit living in the forest. And the holy man tells him, if you want to discover who you are, then you have to obey 3 principles. In the first place, you have to shed all of your noble finery and your armor and your arrogance and play the fool. You have to act as if you are insane when you are around people. Secondly, you can no longer speak. Your tongue has spoken a great deal of evil. Now you must remain silent. And third, you must fast. And you must fast in such a way that it will only accentuate your lowliness. So you can only eat the food that dogs have rejected. These are 3 severe penances, but Robert agrees to abide by them. He eventually makes his way to Rome, and he eventually makes his way into the palace of what the author of this particular romance calls the Emperor of Rome. And he dwells there for 10 years as the emperor's court fool. And he eats only what the dogs that are clustered around the emperor's table refuse to eat. And he sleeps with the dogs, and he utters not one word. And everyone thinks he's just absolutely insane. The emperor is amused by him and keeps him around. Well, at the end of that 10 years, the Saracens, or the Turks, launch a large-scale attack upon the city of Rome. And the emperor is terrified because he doesn't think he can beat them back. But an angel appears to Robert and orders him to put on shining armor and go out and attack the Turks and the Saracens and inspire the emperor's army. And Robert does that, but he does it anonymously. And as soon as the battle is over, which of course is won by the emperor, Robert slinks back to the dog kennel that he lives in, and no one is any the wiser. And this happens 2 more times. The Saracens regroup for 2 more battles, and each time Robert, disguised as this shining knight, goes out and leads the Roman armies against them to victory. Ultimately, his identity is discovered, and the holy hermit who gave him those 3 penances allows him to speak. And he relates to the emperor and the emperor's court who he actually is. The emperor is overjoyed and offers him his daughter. There's the love interest, who is already smitten with Robert, but Robert refuses to take her hand and the empire. And instead he says, "Lords, hear me. I ask you in God's name to be calm. For I am one who will never again belong to this world as long as I live. I will instead keep close watch on my soul, lest the enemy try to surprise me and make me attend to that which is empty and vain." The enemy, of course, here being Satan. At which point Robert joins the hermit in the forest who originally gave him the penance and lives out his days in holy seclusion. Isn't this an interesting tale? You've got the quest. Robert is looking for his identity. Who am I? Why have I done these horrible deeds? What do I need to discover who I really am? You've got the love interest. The Empress's daughter is more than willing to marry Robert when it is discovered that he's the hero who has saved the city of Rome. But Robert will have none of it. His true love is God. And you've got the fulfillment of the quest, because Robert does discover who he is. He discovers it by going at the end of the text to the hermit's hut in the forest and living in prayer until the day he dies. There is a process by which he discovers his true self as opposed to his false self, the false self of Robert the devil, the false self which enjoyed in being wicked, the false self which loved terrorizing people and being a bully and worse. And the steps by which Robert does achieve this new sense of his true self as a child of God who was born to be calm and peaceful and loving are precisely those three penances which the holy hermit gave him. Recall what they are. The first penance is to act the fool. He must act as if he is insane. He must do strange and crazy things which will bring mockery and even, we discover in the text, physical blows to him. That particular penance is geared toward encouraging in the hitherto arrogant Robert the gift of humility, the gift of being able to see oneself not as the center of the universe, but as just one player amongst millions and millions of players in a drama that has been written and is directed and is produced and stars God. And what about the second penance? The holy hermit tells Robert, you may not speak. And Robert doesn't speak for 10 years until he's released from that penance by the holy hermit himself. What does that do to help Robert discover his true self? It seems to me that it encourages deep listening on his part. You and I are so normally noisy that we find it difficult to listen even to external sounds, much less to the still small voice of God. What we need to do in order to discover who we really are, to somehow grow into the likeness of God with which we are born, is to cease making noise and cease attending to noise so that we can become silent enough to hear what's really important, silent enough to hear the whispering of the true self within. Humility, attentive listening, and the third quality that's needed in order to discover one's true self is symbolized by the fasting penance that the holy hermit imposes upon Robert. Fasting means to disassociate oneself from those possessions in the world, from those desires that you have that might separate you from God. We can become so fixated upon things that we want. We can become so fixated upon immediate gratification and more, that we lose sight of what's truly desirable, of what's truly important. Fasting is that spiritual exercise which reattunes us by clearing away all of the clutter of desires that begin to hide us, that begin to conceal from us what's truly valuable and what's truly desirable. So this wonderful medieval romance, Robert the Devil, gives us a roadmap, as it were, to discovering who we really are, as opposed to the false self that all of us in one way or another inevitably put on. A false self that we present to the world and a false self that we begin to actually believe ourselves. Humility, attentive listening, and fasting. Those are the three penances which led Robert from being Robert the Devil to Robert the Holy Hermit. And they can lead you and me from our false selves to our true selves. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you're interested in these videos. I'll see you soon. God bless.